What would you do if you uncovered that the very roots of your family were founded on a lie so dark and twisted it defied nature itself, a secret so deep it could dismantle generations of carefully preserved deceit? In the mist-covered town of Millbrook, tucked away in the lonely valleys of northern Vermont, such a secret had long festered, hidden beneath the polished image of the Caldwell family name. The year was 1937, and 15-year-old Thomas Caldwell was about to be drawn into a mystery so horrifying that Millbrook's people would only whisper about it for decades to come. If stories of forgotten histories and the shadows of human nature intrigue you, stay with me as we unearth a chilling account buried for nearly a century in the dust of courthouse records. It began on a bitter November morning, when the season's first snow laid a false blanket of purity over Millbrook. Thomas Caldwell, a quiet, thoughtful boy with an air of premature seriousness, devoted himself to caring for his younger brother, 7-year-old James. Their bond was unusual. Thomas acted more like a parent than a sibling despite their close ages. Neighbors often commented on his strange maturity, how he walked James to school, made his meals, and tucked him into bed each night. Duties that typically belonged to their parents, Edward and Margaret Caldwell. Edward Caldwell was one of Millbrook's most respected men, a prosperous banker whose ancestors had helped build the town back in the 1870s. His wife, Margaret, was known as a delicate woman, frequently confined to the upper floor of their grand Victorian home on Willow Street due to recurring illness. Outwardly, the Caldwells appeared an ideal family, but those familiar with them sensed a deep unease beneath their polished surface. Their housekeeper, Eliza Morton, would later testify that Edward rarely addressed Thomas directly, and when he did, his words carried an unnatural stiffness, as though speaking to a stranger. That fateful November morning, while searching the attic for winter clothes for his brother, Thomas stumbled upon a locked cedar chest hidden behind a stack of old trunks and broken furniture. He couldn't explain why, but something about the chest called to him, as if it held answers to unspoken questions. Using a hairpin from his mother's vanity, he picked the simple lock, a trick he'd learned from the groundskeeper's son during idle summer days. Inside, beneath layers of fragile yellow tissue, he found a collection of letters, faded photographs, and a small leather-bound diary. It belonged to his mother Margaret and was dated 1921, when she was only 16. Thomas would later recall that the moment his hands touched the worn cover, a cold certainty settled over him. Whatever secrets were written within would forever alter how he saw his family and himself. The attic was bitterly cold, a thin winter light spilling through a small round window. Dust motes drifted lazily in the pale beam as Thomas opened the journal with shaking hands. According to his later testimony recorded by Dr. Harold Fleming for the Vermont Historical Society's Oral History Project, he described that instant as standing before an abyss, aware he was about to fall, yet powerless to turn away. At first, the entries seemed harmless enough, the idle reflections of a teenage girl from a well-to-do family. But as he read on, the tone grew darker. Margaret wrote of feeling imprisoned in her own home, suffocated by her father, Judge Augustus Walsh, a man known throughout the county for his stern rulings and unbending sense of morality. What truly froze Thomas's blood were the entries from the spring of 1922, where Margaret described her mounting terror over the changes in her body, a fear so profound she couldn't bring herself to name it, even in her private journal. Among the documents inside the chest, Thomas discovered medical files from a secluded sanitarium in Burlington, showing that Margaret had spent 6 months there that same year. The official cause of admittance was listed as nervous exhaustion. Yet, the physician's handwritten notes, later uncovered during a state inquiry, told a different story, one intentionally disguised in the formal record. These notes referred to a young patient admitted under mysterious circumstances, carrying a pregnancy that was to remain strictly secret. When the courthouse records were finally unsealed in 1972, they revealed that Judge Augustus Walsh had used his influence to have his daughter admitted under false pretenses. From the journal and medical papers, Thomas pieced together an unspeakable truth. His mother had given birth while confined to the institution, a birth hidden from the world of Millbrook. But the infant hadn't been sent away for adoption, as was customary for unmarried mothers at the time. Driven now by an unbearable need to know more, Thomas continued searching through the chest. There he found a damaged birth certificate, the ink smudged as if deliberately blurred. The father's name was unreadable, but the mother's was clear: Margaret Walsh. The child's name? Thomas Walsh, born June 12, 1922. He froze, staring at the date. It was his own birthday, the one he had celebrated every year of his life. In that moment, the world seemed to tilt around him. What he uncovered next, however, never appeared in any official record. Hidden among the letters was a torn, unsent confession addressed to a cousin in California. In it, Margaret revealed the horrifying truth that her own father, Judge Walsh, was the man responsible for her pregnancy. The letter was never mailed, likely out of fear or unbearable shame, but its revelation would haunt Thomas Caldwell for the rest of his days. He was not Edward Caldwell's son, as he had always believed. He was the product of something unspeakable, born of his own grandfather's violation. In the most nightmarish sense, he was both his mother's son and her brother. The realization shattered him. For 3 days, Thomas spoke to no one, carrying the unbearable truth in silence while maintaining the routines of his daily life. Walking James to school, helping with his lessons, feeling all the while as though he were trapped in a waking nightmare. According to Eliza Morton's later testimony, she discovered Thomas on the 4th day in the garden shed, sitting motionless before the open journal and scattered documents laid out across the workbench. Eliza, who had served the Caldwells since before Thomas's birth, may have been the only person who had ever suspected what lay buried beneath the family's carefully constructed facade. In her sworn statement to investigators in 1938, she confessed that she had accompanied Margaret to the sanitarium as her private nurse and had been bound to secrecy about what occurred there. She had long feared that Thomas might one day uncover the truth, though never under such dreadful circumstances. That revelation marked only the beginning of a chain of darker discoveries that would eventually destroy the Caldwell family. With Eliza's hesitant cooperation, Thomas began piecing together the full scope of the deception that had defined his life. Edward Caldwell, it seemed, had been part of the cover up from the very start. As a young banker with ambitions of rising in society, he had agreed to marry Margaret Walsh under terms dictated by Judge Walsh himself. The marriage was arranged shortly after Margaret's release from the sanitarium, with the infant Thomas presented to the world as a charitable adoption of a distant relative's orphaned child. The union had benefited Edward enormously. Judge Walsh used his position and influence to secure Edward's professional advancement and provided him with financial backing, aid that later proved vital when the Depression struck and many banks collapsed. In return, Edward was to uphold the lie for life, never disclosing Thomas's true parentage to anyone, not even to Thomas himself. But as Thomas pressed deeper into the family's history, poring over newspapers, public ledgers, and town archives under the guise of a school research project, he uncovered evidence that the deceit extended far beyond his own birth. 7 years after he came into the world, Margaret had given birth to James, introduced publicly as the natural son of Edward and Margaret Caldwell. Yet hospital records, which Thomas managed to view with the help of a sympathetic nurse, told a different story. James's birth certificate listed Edward as the father, but the space for the mother's name showed clear tampering. The name Margaret Caldwell had been written over another, faintly visible beneath the ink. Using handwriting samples and a magnifying glass borrowed from his science teacher, Thomas painstakingly compared the letters. What he uncovered left him reeling. The original name appeared to be his own. If that was true, then Thomas, at just 8 years old, had somehow become the father of his own younger brother. The idea seemed impossible, until he found the horrifying proof. The explanation emerged from a set of medical files hidden beneath a false compartment in his mother's jewelry box, discovered during one of her frequent bouts of illness that confined her to bed for days. These records described a deeply disturbing procedure carried out at a private clinic in Boston known for its experimental fertility research. According to the documents, genetic material had been taken from Thomas, without his knowledge, under the pretense of routine medical testing, and later used to impregnate Margaret. The motive behind this grotesque act was revealed in a letter from the clinic's director to Judge Augustus Walsh, who had orchestrated the entire operation. The correspondence outlined the judge's obsession with what he termed preserving a distinct inheritance through controlled familial breeding. The letters detached, Scientific tone only magnified its horror, describing the deliberate creation of a child who would, by design, be both Thomas's brother and his biological son. No one in the household ever dared to speak of it. Not even when Thomas, unable to bear the weight of silence, confronted Edward Caldwell with the evidence he had meticulously compiled. According to Eliza Morton's later account, this confrontation occurred in Edward's study on December 3, 1937. Thomas had arranged every document in careful order, presenting them like evidence in a courtroom, a habit that would define him in later life. Edward did not deny a single claim. Instead, he gave Thomas a choice: uphold the lie and continue enjoying the privileges of the Caldwell name, or expose the truth and ruin everyone involved, including the innocent James, who remained unaware of his unnatural origins. Torn between justice and love for his brother, Thomas chose a third option. He copied every record, every letter, every piece of evidence, sealing the duplicates in waterproof containers and hiding them in 3 separate locations across Millbrook. Then, summoning all his courage, he went to confront Judge Walsh himself. No one witnessed what transpired between them, but the next day, the judge suffered a massive stroke that left him partially paralyzed and unable to speak. For a time, Thomas believed he had uncovered the full extent of his family's corruption, but one final clue would reveal a horror far greater than he had imagined. In his mother's journal, he found references to others, families who had been subjected to the judge's experiments, in what he chillingly called lineage purification. Following these hints, Thomas located a locked records room in the basement of the Millbrook courthouse. Using a key stolen from the judge's study, while the old man lay incapacitated, Thomas gained entry. What he discovered there confirmed his worst fears. Inside were confidential files on at least 5 other families from Millbrook and neighboring towns, each linked to similar arrangements, each manipulated under the judge's direction, and all involving doctors, lawyers, and clergymen who had conspired to maintain the facade of respectability. These families shared. The judge had been monitoring rare genetic traits across generations, constructing a covert breeding experiment masked by the farce aid of ordinary small-town respectability. The scale of this conspiracy, and the horror of its implications, was so immense that when state authorities finally exposed it years later, much of the documentation was locked away by court order, judged too disturbing for the public eye. Yet even that was not the darkest revelation contained in the courthouse archives. Judge Walsh had not acted alone. He was part of a broader circle of powerful men throughout New England who shared his obsession with what they termed ancestral consolidation. This secret society included physicians, researchers, and legal figures who exchanged letters filled with pseudoscientific ramblings about genetic refinement and the creation of a superior human line through controlled reproduction. They called themselves the lineage, and their covert operations had gone undetected for decades. Thomas's uncovering of this organization set off a chain of events that would later become one of the most suppressed investigations in Vermont's history. According to partially declassified FBI records from 1983, Thomas began meticulously charting the lineage's structure, mapping their associations, documenting their meetings, and collecting hard proof of their crimes. He pursued this secret inquiry while maintaining an appearance of normal life, caring for James and preserving the illusion of calm within an increasingly fractured Caldwell home. Edward Caldwell, realizing that Thomas had unearthed more than just their family's hidden truths, began moving to contain the threat. Bank records revealed several sizable withdrawals in the weeks after his confrontation with Thomas. Funds investigators later believed were meant to finance either Thomas's silence or his disappearance. But Thomas had foreseen such a risk. He had already entrusted duplicate evidence to his history teacher, Mr. Martin Reynolds, with strict instructions to forward it to the state if anything happened to him. On January 17, 1938, the situation reached its tragic peak. Police found Edward Caldwell dead in his study, an apparent suicide by hanging. His note spoke of remorse for unnamed sins and begged his family's forgiveness. Yet later forensic review, conducted as part of the state's suppressed investigation, indicated something far more sinister. Marks on Edward's neck and defensive injuries on his hands hinted at a struggle. Details initially dismissed or perhaps purposely ignored by the town coroner, who was later tied to Judge Walsh's inner circle. At just 15, Thomas suddenly became the de facto head of the Caldwell household. His mother, Margaret, meanwhile, had withdrawn completely, slipping deeper into what doctors described as a near catatonic state. After Edward's death, James, still believing Thomas to be merely his older brother, relied on him completely for emotional and practical support. Thomas, however, carried the unbearable truth that he was both James's brother and biological father, a grotesque distortion of nature forced upon him without his consent or understanding. Their lives might have continued in uneasy silence, the secrets of the Caldwell family and the lineage buried beneath small, town respectability, if not for the intervention of Martin Reynolds. Troubled by Thomas's increasingly erratic behavior and suspicious of the circumstances surrounding Edward's death, Reynolds decided to review the documents Thomas had entrusted to him. What he found was so alarming that he broke his promise to wait and immediately contacted state authorities. Investigators arrived in Millbrook on February 3, 1938, officially to re-examine Edward Caldwell's apparent suicide. What began as a straightforward inquiry quickly widened as they uncovered the first traces of the vast conspiracy Judge Walsh and his associates had maintained for decades. Judge Walsh, still recovering from his stroke, was taken into custody but died before facing formal charges, carrying many of his secrets to the grave. Margaret Caldwell was committed to a state psychiatric institution, where she remained until her death in 1952, never publicly discussing the events that had consumed her life. James was placed into foster care, his true parentage concealed to protect him from the shame that revelation would bring. Thomas, the young man who had exposed the truth, was placed under state protection and given a new identity to shield him from possible retaliation by surviving members of the lineage. The investigation stretched on for years, eventually drawing federal attention as links to similar networks in neighboring states emerged. Much of the evidence uncovered was classified as too explosive for public release, court records were sealed, and those involved were bound by strict confidentiality. To the people of Millbrook, the official story was far simpler. Judge Walsh had been implicated in financial misconduct that drove Edward Caldwell to take his own life. Most residents accepted this explanation, preferring the comfort of a lie to the horror of the truth. Yet whispers persisted. Local legends told of dark experiments, of the cursed Caldwell house on Willow Street, which stood vacant for decades, a place no one wished to call home. Children dared one another to approach it on Halloween, swearing they saw ghostly figures moving behind its dusty panes. The most comprehensive account of the Caldwell affair and the lineage conspiracy would later be assembled by Dr. Harold Fleming of the Vermont Historical Society in 1977. He interviewed Thomas, then living under the name Thomas Miller, who was by that time 55 years old and retired after a long career as a postal inspector. Perhaps in his pursuit of mail fraud, Thomas found a way to continue the work that had defined his youth, uncovering deception wherever it tried to hide. Thomas's lifelong commitment to uncovering hidden truths seemed to define him even in later years. According to Dr. Fleming's notes, Thomas kept occasional contact with James, never revealing the true nature of their relationship, but quietly watching over him from a distance. James went on to become a high school science teacher, married with 3 children, living an entirely ordinary life, never knowing that his brother was in fact his father. Thomas, by contrast, never married. He told Dr. Fleming that he could not, in good conscience, risk passing on what he called the Walsh taint, his term for the corrupted genetic legacy engineered by his grandfather's interference. The interviews painted the portrait of a man who had achieved a degree of peace with his past, yet remained burdened by its shadows. Thomas confessed that he still feared the lineage had not been completely eradicated, believing that some of its members had simply gone underground, refining their methods to avoid detection rather than abandoning their twisted ideals. His fears proved to have merit. In 1983, a routine audit of a private fertility clinic in Burlington exposed evidence of genetic testing practices disturbingly similar to those described in the old lineage records. The physician responsible, Dr. Robert Chambers, was revealed to be the grandson of one of Judge Walsh's close associates. Further inquiry showed that Chambers had been quietly collecting genetic samples from families whose backgrounds aligned with the profiles targeted by the lineage decades earlier. Before investigators could fully question him, Chambers took his own life, The probe into his activities led to the partial declassification of the original Caldwell case files as officials sought to understand the historical roots of what appeared to be a resurgence of the lineage's ideology. These documents confirmed many long, whispered details that had previously existed only as rumor and speculation. The revelation that remnants of the lineage might have survived into the modern age prompted a sweeping review of fertility clinics and genetic research centers across New England. Though no widespread conspiracy on the scale of the original lineage was uncovered, investigators identified isolated incidents that bore unsettling similarities to its methods. The most alarming involved a respected geneticist at a Boston research institute who had been conducting unauthorized experiments, merging genetic material from closely related individuals. When confronted, he claimed his work was based on inherited research notes from his great-uncle. Later confirmed to be a member of Judge Walsh's inner circle, these modern reverberations of the Caldwell affair suggested that Thomas's long-held fears had not been misplaced. The dark ideas born in secret laboratories and hidden basements decades earlier had not vanished entirely. They had merely evolved, adapting to new scientific frontiers while preserving the same dangerous conviction that humanity could be improved. Through control and manipulation of its own bloodlines, James Caldwell, unaware of the true scope of his family's past, attended the quiet dedication ceremony for the park in 2007. By then, he was an elderly man, his hair silvered. His posture stooped, yet his presence carried a quiet dignity. He had come, as he told a local reporter, simply to honor those who came before. To the townspeople, he was just another aging resident paying tribute to local history. None suspected that he was, in fact, both the living embodiment of that history and the final branch of a family tree warped by generations of secrecy and ambition. Standing before the modest bronze plaque that read, "To those who endured unspeakable violations of their most fundamental rights," James lingered in silence. Perhaps he sensed, in some unspoken way, that his connection to that place ran deeper than he could ever know. The park itself was peaceful. A few benches beneath maples, a small fountain, the distant laughter of children. Yet beneath that serenity lay the soil of a house that had once hidden horrors beyond comprehension. After the ceremony, James visited the Vermont Historical Society to donate a few personal papers and family photographs, unaware that only a few rooms away, his father's sealed journals, the life's work of Thomas Caldwell, rested in climate, controlled storage, locked away from public view. Inside those journals lay the truth of his own existence, the documentation of a secret so monstrous that Thomas had chosen to bear it alone, sacrificing personal peace to ensure that James would remain untouched by it. In a sense, Thomas's final wish had been fulfilled. The lineage had ended with him. The twisted legacy of Judge Walsh and his followers had found no new vessel, no next generation to carry it forward. What remained was memory, carefully guarded, partially erased, but never entirely gone. The Caldwell case endures in academic circles as both a grim historical curiosity and a moral parable. Scholars continue to debate its implications, the fine line between science and hubris, between curiosity and corruption. The Vermont Historical Society occasionally permits limited exhibitions of artifacts related to the case. Faded photographs, fragments of correspondence, and excerpts from Thomas's writings, always framed by warnings about ethical responsibility in the age of genetic engineering. Today, the park in Millbrook is indistinguishable from any other small town green. Parents push strollers, teenagers gather by the fountain, and the past seems as distant as the mountains on the horizon. Yet for those who know the story, or those who have read Thomas Caldwell's final plea for vigilance, the place carries an echo. It is a reminder that progress without conscience leads inevitably back to the same darkness from which humanity once struggled to emerge. And so, the story of the Caldwell lineage ends not with revelation, but with silence. A silence chosen out of mercy, preserved through restraint, and carried forward as a warning. A testament to one man's refusal to let horror define him, and to his enduring belief that compassion, not control, is what keeps the human family whole. Past do not find new life in the present. Yet as history has shown, ideas, even the most abhorrent, rarely die completely. They mutate, adapt, and wait for moments of weakness in human judgment to take root once again. The ideology that once drove the lineage, the belief that humanity could be perfected, through selective breeding, now finds echoes in modern debates over gene editing, reproductive technologies, and the ethics of designer, offspring. Though cloaked in the language of progress, the underlying temptation remains the same: to take command of the natural order, to shape life according to human ideals rather than moral restraint. Within the secure vaults of the Vermont Historical Society, the Caldwell archives remain sealed under heavy restriction. Scholars permitted limited access often describe a sense of unease while handling the documents, as if the words themselves carry a residue of the madness that spawned them. Among the papers are Judge Walsh's personal correspondences, anatomical charts marked with strange genealogical symbols, and transcripts of early experiments that blurred the line between science and ritual. But it is Thomas Caldwell's journals that hold the greatest weight, page after page of meticulous observation, sorrow, and moral struggle. His writings reveal not only his pursuit of truth, but his desperate attempt to understand how intelligence and faith could coexist with such profound evil. The Special Committee continues to monitor new requests for access, wary of those whose interests stray beyond academic curiosity. In recent years, a few applications have raised red flags. Researchers who appeared to fixate on the genetic consolidation principles that had once defined the lineage's philosophy. Their proposals were quietly denied, and in at least one case, the applicant was later found to be affiliated with a fringe transhumanist group advocating for selective genetic enhancement. Even so, whispers persist that fragments of the lineage's theories survive in underground research circles. A reminder that vigilance must never wane. As one committee member wrote in a confidential memorandum in 2022, the danger is not that people will repeat the Caldwell experiments exactly, but that they will convince themselves they are doing something different, something justified by progress, efficiency, or compassion. That is how it always begins. Meanwhile, in Millbrook, the park that stands where the Caldwell house once stood continues to serve as a quiet monument to both tragedy and renewal. Children still play where unspeakable secrets once festered, their laughter echoing through the trees as if to defy the darkness that came before. But beneath the soil, beneath the calm surface of memory, the roots of that story remain, entwined with the town's history, and perhaps with the conscience of anyone who learns it. The story of the Caldwell lineage endures not because it is sensational, but because it forces an uncomfortable reckoning. It asks whether humanity, in its pursuit of perfection, can resist becoming the very monster it seeks to overcome. Thomas Caldwell's final warning, never improve upon nature through unnatural selection, rings with renewed relevance in every debate over genetic ethics today. And so, his voice continues to echo, through sealed archives, through cautious historians, through the silent park in Millbrook, a voice from the past urging the living to remember that the true measure of human advancement lies not in mastery over life, but in the compassion that preserves its imperfection. His story is more than a relic of a darker era. It is a mirror reflecting humanity's enduring struggle between moral restraint and the pursuit of control. The tragedy of the Caldwell family reveals that evil does not always appear in monstrous form. Sometimes it wears the face of reason, cloaked in the language of progress and purity. Judge Walsh and his followers believed they were serving a higher cause, but in seeking to perfect the human lineage, they desecrated the very essence of what it means to be human. Thomas Caldwell's quiet courage stands as the counterpoint to their corruption. He could have chosen to expose his brother's true parentage, to lash out at the world that had twisted his life beyond recognition. Instead, he chose empathy. He shielded James from unbearable knowledge, bearing the pain himself so another might live unbroken. That single act of compassion remains his greatest defiance, a refusal to let cruelty define him. Today, as society pushes further into the frontiers of genetic science, the Caldwell story feels less like ancient history and more like prophecy. The questions that haunted Thomas's time, about how far humanity should go in shaping its own destiny, echo louder than ever. Can the pursuit of progress exist without losing sight of morality? Can science advance without repeating the sins of the past in new and more sophisticated forms? The park in Millbrook stands serene, its swings creaking softly in the breeze. Children laugh where pain once thrived, their joy a living rebuttal to the lineage's obsession with control. Yet for those who know the history, The ground itself seems to whisper a warning that every generation must guard against the temptation to play God. Thomas Caldwell's legacy endures not in monuments or archives, but in the moral lesson his life embodies, that dignity, compassion, and acceptance of human imperfection are the true hallmarks of progress. His voice, preserved in the fading pages of his journals and in the memories of those who study them, continues to urge caution. And so, long after the Caldwell house fell and the town of Millbrook moved on, his story remains, a quiet testament that beneath every attempt to engineer perfection lies the risk of destroying what makes us human. The final echo of his life's work reminds us that even in a world of advancing technology and shifting ethics, one truth remains eternal: to protect humanity, we must first remember our own.